Okay, well, welcome everyone and good evening, and good to see you all here at another Young Fabians Future of Finance Network event. Today, talking about social housing. This event's entitled Social Housing, Who is it for? Crucially, I suppose, for Future of Finance Network, where will the money come from? For those of you that aren't members of the network or of the Young Fabians are the youth wing of the Fabian Society, oldest think tank in existence. I'm going to say that even if it isn't true. It's a good tagline. And the Future of Finance Network is about 2 years old now and has really been at the forefront of taking young professionals working in the industry from our side of the political debate and really linking up with the city and finance in a coherent way. But given the issues that we're facing around housing, I'm really delighted that we were able to put together such a fantastic panel. Who will be able to give us, hopefully, some real insights and answers moving such an important area forward. I think, does anyone here own their own home? Your hands? Okay, not necessarily the majority, and certain people definitely giving a grimace of no, not yet, maybe never. So actually social housing is a massive issue for the country. Just to put it into some context before I introduce the panel, home ownership declining. I think it's forecasted to be just over 60% by 2021, from a peak of around over 70%. So, significant drop, quite a short space of time. But actually, it's not just people who can't afford to buy their own homes. There's 1.7 million households on the social housing waiting list, so quite a lot of demand pent up there. And actually, if you thought it was just about bricks and mortar, really shocking statistic from Shelter, 1.4 million children living in bad housing, over 600,000 families in overcrowded homes, and 49,000 homes in this country just hanging around temporary accommodation waiting for somewhere stable. So really big issue here that we need to get to grips on.
Well, thank you very much, Chair. Can I start with three quick stories from my own constituency? First of all, the loving family with three late teens, early 20s living with them, wonderful kids, but as both the kids on the one hand and the mum and dad on the other hand said, we'd love them to move out. But there's no chance of them being able so to do. One is a professional, one is at university, and the third has a very good job in, as it happens, in finance. And none of them can afford to get a mortgage. All of them have tried, notwithstanding the fact that their parents can give them some assistance. Second story is, I remember going to a house in the Stockman Green area where there was 7 young people living in a private rented sector. Appalling accommodation, all of them paying, and this is in Birmingham now, £90 a week. You can imagine, therefore, what the landlord was making out of that house. And the third example is that if you go just down from where I live in the constituency to the wonderful YMCA Reservoir Road project, what you see are the growing numbers of young homeless, people who are fine men and women who have ended up with their lives falling apart for one reason or another, and literally on the streets with their lives being rebuilt by the YMCA and some wonderful people with whom they work. So whether it's young people who want to get a mortgage, whether it's young people who want to rent or for whatever reason decide that they have to rent, or whether at its most extreme, it's the young homeless, we have a massive and growing problem. Now, as the Chair said, if you look at the scale of the problem, can I just say three things? First about us, second about them, and the third is a simple reality in relation to housing that we are determined to change. About us, I'm not going to go into detail other than to say we did in government much that was admirable. The 2 million new homes, 1 million new mortgage holders, 500,000 more affordable homes, 1.6 million decent homes, homes that were renovated under the Decent Homes project. Also in 2008, the action that we took to keep people in their homes on the one hand and to get the housing market moving on the other hand, the Kickstart programme that saw 110,000 homes built, 70,000 jobs created, 3,000 apprenticeships. So if we did much that was good, our record compares, to say the least, favourably with a record of miserable economic and housing failure. And the statistics are stark. A Grant Shapps said, housing is the gold standard by which we shall be judged. House building down 11%. What brought him into politics was homelessness, or homeless families up by 13%. Homeless rough sleepers up by 23%. It fell 70% under ours. We have a mortgage market where people can't get mortgages, and a rapidly growing private rented sector about to overtake the social sector in terms of size. Legitimate role to play, but characterised by a lot of rogue landlords as well as the reputable, ever rising rents. And actually, if you look at the statistics, 1 in 2 of homes in the private rented sector don't meet decent home standard. So if we did much that was good, if they are failing, let me just say this in all sincerity, is that we have to face up to this simple reality. The housing crisis does not date back to May 2010. Housing has not been sufficiently centre stage in British politics for 25 years and more. We are determined to change that. It's how, therefore, do you tackle the biggest housing crisis in a generation, and how do you ensure, as we will, that housing is centre stage in the run-up to the next election? The dominant issue is supply. It's what we do now and what we say in 2015. What we are about to launch is an innovation network of some of the best labour local authorities in Britain. That will be going for it using HRA reform, land and other levers, imaginative partnership agreements with the private sector, with housing associations, new council build, co-op build, self-build has a role to play, innovative financial models demonstrating that even in straitened times, labour local authorities can make a real difference, and crucially informing our direction of travel up to 2015. What we have argued for already is a stimulus package now, the famous banker's bonus tax. We'll be further developing that at the next stages, because history tells us, 2008, that if you've got an economic crisis and also you have badly needed homes, the best and quickest way to get the economy moving is to invest in house building. And so we will be developing that argument further at the next stages. We're also looking at some very radical and imaginative ideas around how you tackle some of the fundamental problems in the building and land industries. If I can give, you'll forgive me if I say this, I can't go into too much detail at the moment, but if I can give one example. If you look at land, there's plenty of available development land. There's land with planning permission for 300,000 homes. There's a lot of trading that goes on in land, and there's not enough building that goes on in land. So a lot of people are making money out of land, but they're not necessarily building that for which they've got planning permission. We intend to take action on that. On the private rented sector, we are at an advanced stage of a radically different model of PRS provision in future. It has a legitimate role to play, but it must in future be characterised by longer term tenancies, a formula that we will be proposing in relation to rents, effective regulation of the private rented sector, and a sector in which there are no place for the rogues, where the reputable are incentivised, and where you create a framework for investment, in particular institutional investment in the PRS. And then finally, the focus in relation to today, in relation to social housing. Let me say this, the direction of travel is clear. Under this government, it is the death of social housing. It is the progressive marginalisation and demonisation of social housing and those who live in it. And we fundamentally object to that. As far as the affordable rent model is concerned, it's far from affordable on the one hand. And on the other hand, you talk to some local authorities and some housing associations, combination of that taken together with other things like direct payment poses real question marks over the capacity to achieve new build. So we will not be sticking with what the government has currently introduced in terms of the affordable rent model, and we will be bringing forward our proposals for a radically different approach. Crucially, we will commit to grant and investment. We're not going to make commitments in relation to 2015 now, but let's also face this reality. We will still live in straitened times in 2015. So what government does is key, but it's also how you achieve innovation, including multiplier benefit. Let me just give you one practical example of that before I close. And that is that the National Housing Federation has done some excellent work around what £1 billion of investment levers in by way of £8 to £10 billion in new build, achieving the new build of 70,000 homes, creating 300,000 jobs directly, indirectly, and along the supply chain. So you need that combination for the future in terms of a major uplift in supply of investment and innovation. Innovation including further reform of the HRA, opening up headroom for borrowing for local authorities. So I think I've given you a flavour of our direction of travel, and very much look forward to your ideas.
I think when we look at social housing, one of the things to consider is that originally social housing was provided actually for working class people. So organisations like Peabody and Guinness were providing better standard of accommodation, in fact aspirational accommodation compared to what was available in the private sector at the time. So I've been around estates in South London where they quite very proudly to where the bathhouse was, and you had to book up a week in advance and get the guy to stoke the boiler, but at least you had access to a bath. So think about where the roots are. In fact, I'm talking to Bill Randall, who's the leader of Brighton Council. He's writing a book on the history of Peabody, and he says that they received complaints apparently in the 19th century about how good the Peabody accommodation was, and it was too expensive for the charity. Anyway, the thing is now that who's it for? Social housing is now targeted at the very most disadvantaged groups in society, which is absolutely fine. You have to help those sort of people, but there's a whole load of other people who actually are in housing need who can't necessarily access social housing. Now, what the current system has tended to lead to is a concentration of poverty in some estates, and also a culture of dependency and a lack of ambition in certain areas. And that's an offshoot, it's an unintended consequence of basically the way that social housing has basically developed over perhaps the last 25 years. And I think now there's economic and social pressures for these things to change. I've been around the country since the start of the year, and I've met at least 20 local authorities from Durham down to Cornwall, and I think there are changing attitudes. And I think the emphasis, when I've gone round, I've been housing summits, say in the north, they was concerned basically about the jobs and growth agenda as housing, but they want to see housing because of the quick boost it can give to local economies. So I think that shouldn't be overlooked. The other thing which has come out, actually, when you look at social housing, who's it for, I think I have actually heard of a summit where they were talking about a lost generation, about people who've been out of work for 20 or 30 years, and how really they're focusing their attention now on the next generation, people they're going to try and house, almost sort of giving up on the people that have been, you can call it, been relying on help over that period. And I think that's quite a worrying development, actually, in terms of social cohesion. So how to promote housing development generally, because we haven't got enough houses generally, affordable housing in particular, and how can you build sustainable communities? Not a tenure culture is probably something we don't want to repeat, so you need to get basically integrated communities. What we'd like to do is to try and create places where people want to live and are accessible to all sections of the community, not places where you have to go and live because you can't afford to go anywhere else. And that applies to affordable housing. It applies also to, I think, private rental accommodation, which I think is going to feature very largely in the coming years. And in terms of market accommodation, you talk about access and home ownership. I think there's going to be a fundamental shift. If you compare the UK to foreign housing markets, then you'll see the reliance on owner occupation here is very, very high. But given the average house price and the affordability of this, with a low inflation economy, job insecurity, how many people have got the deposit and the will to mortgage themselves to the hilt? And all that to pay off 250,000 or 500,000 out of tax income through a working life. Up to now, we've relied on inflation, and this is why owner occupation has been very popular, but we can't really necessarily rely on that again in the future. A lot depends what happens in the world economic stage. But there are some answers, I think, that are beginning to emerge, and Jack sort of alluded to some of those. In my discussions with local authorities, I've seen a lot of basically appetite to promote affordable housing, it's a very high priority, but also private rental accommodation, and try and linking that to jobs and to local economies, and to try and get people to stay in communities so they use the local schools and the local facilities, so you don't create sort of enclaves outside, almost gated communities outside of the cities. So if you go to Wolverhampton, they'll talk about the Land Rover, the Jaguar Land Rover plant, and their objective is actually to try and get the people that are going to work there to actually live closer to Wolverhampton, so they can use the local facilities rather than commute. So there may be incentive mechanisms you can get for people to start off perhaps in private rental accommodation, but with options to buy. So you give incentives for them to do that. So when they go into that accommodation, it's not a short-term stopgap measure. They can put down their roots. So there are mechanisms that are coming out, and there's potential, I think, to attract institutional investment. But there are barriers. The institutions, basically, they've got the three objections I've received when I've been talking to institutions. Firstly, that they don't want to get involved in development. That's too risky. They prefer that to be done by somebody else. Secondly, the institutions are not interested in housing management. They need to take work with organisations that have already got that infrastructure, which is registered providers or local authorities. They don't want the chairman being worried about the fact that Mrs. Miggins' gas boiler sort of broken down, and all the sort of disadvantage and acrimony can come out of that. And they don't understand the asset class. So I think what's going to have to happen here is that the government and the public sector are going to need to facilitate this investment by working together. There will be new forms of partnership, but the public sector must intervene, I think. But there is an appetite out there from both the public sector, the local authorities in particular, the registered providers and the institutions to do this, and government needs to galvanise this if we're going to do something about social housing.
Absolutely.
Private rented sector is underused in the UK. In the US, it's a whole industry. Stephen talked earlier on about institutions not understanding the rented sector. The last 25 years, Jack, the industry in the US has grown to such an extent that the institutions view it as the second most favoured investment class after commercial offices. Why can't that happen in the UK? Different mentality. Yes, institutions in the UK are not interested in management, but you have to do that. Otherwise people won't move into private rented accommodation unless it's professionally managed. The quality of the accommodation is acceptable. And also it's value for money. The living costs, if they could seem to be lower in rented accommodation, that's a hugely attractive reason for them to occupy your particular scheme development. The private rented sector in the UK, it's got a bad name at the moment because it's really small buy-to-let investors. But if an organisation was to come in and do a similar operation that Regis did in the commercial offices, where they actually raised the standard of management across the board and provided serviced accommodation up and down the UK, you create a different type of accommodation to what we've previously been seeing in the UK. But the key thing for private rented accommodation attribute, I think, in this current climate is that it's a real opportunity for local authorities to use it as a precursor to economic growth. The multiplier effect is one key advantage. The business model for private rented sector is not based on land value, it's based on having a huge supply, increasing your supply. It's similar to what happened in the UK in the 1960s and 70s, where council housing developments took place. That was the biggest output for the construction industry ever, full stop. And it was based on a business model of renting housing, not selling housing. And that's the opportunity I think that the UK has going into the next 5 or 6 years, particularly for local authorities that are keen to see rented housing as an option to stimulate economic growth, to give more options locally and regionally. Corporate decisions where to locate are based on the labour pool. If your labour pool has to vacate the region, you're in a downward cycle. And if your neighbour makes a decision to invest in more housing solutions, it's actually a zero-sum game. They win, you lose. And if you bring in professionally managed private rented accommodation, I think that will just completely change the scenario from having to wait for land values to drop to a level where it's acceptable, to wait for mortgages to go. You'll actually have a generator in your area which can be picked up and put on the ground and can be made to drive the local economy pretty short term as opposed to medium term.
I do work for a developer. It's worth just a little bit of background. I mean, I work for a developer called Argent, and we're most active. We're not that big a developer, but we're most active in Birmingham, Manchester, and London. In Birmingham, Jack might know Brindley Place quite well, which we developed, which doesn't include much housing, let alone much affordable housing. I think such things didn't really come onto the radar back in the early 90s in Birmingham when we were starting Brindley Place. And in Manchester, we're doing some stuff around Piccadilly in the centre of Manchester, and we are doing housing there. Again, there's not really a discussion. There is now starting in Manchester, but there hasn't been a discussion really about affordable housing, and that's partly because we're selling, I'd like to think, extremely high quality new build apartments in the centre of Manchester for about £250 a square foot, which, to put that in context, is less than you can sell or have been able to sell until very recently social housing in King's Cross, which is our most well-known development, to an RSL backed by grant. So you can sell social housing to a good RSL to help manage the stock in King's Cross for considerably more than you can sell open market product in Manchester. And I think that just kind of gives you some indication of one of the scales of the problem that we're dealing with in terms of the regional differences we're talking about. There's not one problem across the UK. There's very much a London and South East problem, and then there's other problems in other parts of the country, and that's certainly how we see it. So how have we ended up in a situation where people are paying us more than the market price in Manchester for social housing in King's Cross? Well, we have a development in King's Cross that includes about 1,700 homes, and the deal that we struck in a slightly different era of both grant and economic situation was that we would do about 42% affordable at King's Cross, and there was a grant regime assumed behind that, and the first buildings backed by that grant are now coming to be completed. The first building completes in July and the second building completes at the end of the year. We think they're fantastic and we're very proud of them, and they're great buildings, and they're the first housing to be at King's Cross, and the grant system has helped deliver that, and we're very proud of those buildings. But they are not going to be repeated. It's worth just illustrating the issue. If you assume, for sake of argument, to keep it simple, that one of those flats possibly costs us about £200,000 to deliver, you could argue about land and infrastructure and so on, but it basically costs about £200,000 to deliver a smallish unit. About 70,000 of that, give or take, is basically being paid for by the RSL based on its capitalised rental stream. That's the value of the rents they're collecting from their tenants. The rest of it has been coming from grant. So the reality is that 2/3 of the purchase price has been coming from the grant regime. Now, I must admit, I have a genuinely split personality about this. I actually really got bought into the whole notion of mixed and balanced communities and mixed tenure, and we're doing all that at King's Cross. But the reality is it's very, very expensive on the public purse to end up to keep buying these units where you're pumping in £120,000, £130,000 of public money per unit to enable your right, what tends to be the most disadvantaged, to live in the very centre of town, where perhaps they're not, you could argue, making the best use of that facility compared to other people that are equally shut out of the housing market and aren't able to access what they would like to live in either. And I think, so I have a split personality on that. I can see the reasons for it, and I buy into the principles, but equally I do wonder about the overall value for money of that policy when taken to perhaps the extremes that we did. The company I work for, Argent, is actually wholly owned by the British Telecom Pension Scheme, who is one of the biggest institutions in the UK. And we've discussed, as you can imagine, this issue of institutional investment in residential quite a few times. And I can't speak for the pension scheme or indeed I should add Argent tonight. But I think there are some other factors at play, because this issue of institutional investment in housing has been the holy grail for 25, 30 years, and it hasn't happened. And I would love to think that everyone's right, they're on the cusp of this new dawn, but I have to say I'm not convinced that we are. I think there's a number of factors at play. Scale is definitely one of them. I know one of you mentioned scale, but we have to get a bigger scale to enable the institutional investors to buy and take a sort of risk-adjusted position across different places and different products. Scale is definitely a factor. A long-term settlement is necessary. The reality is that politicians do like meddling in housing, and institutions fear that. Institutions compare it to offices and other asset classes, and they see political interference. They see housing with politics in a way that offices and shops and other asset classes are not. And you know, in a way, your comments sort of in a way illustrate the point that you see the need to change things, but that just scares the horses in terms of institutions, and that's one of the things that I think we do have to deal with. It's also true that the house builders, I mean, in central London where we are here today, most housing is not being delivered by traditional house builders. They're being delivered by commercial development companies like us. The one exception I would add is Berkeley Group, who remain kind of sort of preeminent really. But elsewhere, delivery has been the preserve of basically traditional house builders. And they haven't been particularly long-term model developers. There's a perfectly honourable role model to be a trading developer. But the reality in most places where demand exceeds supply, which is where you want to be solving the problem, they can make more money by selling their stock to owner-occupiers who want to buy the product now for what they perceive as the value to them, as opposed to what an institution will pay for it, which is based on a multiple of rent. There is a gap. The reality is that they can sell it more on that basis. So I think we need to start thinking about some quite radical solutions, and I'd be really keen to hear them. I think a long-term settlement on housing is part of it. I've been to so many meetings with the Housing Corporation now and the other HCA, where you hear this annuality problem of I've got to spend money tomorrow or I lose it, or this money's being withdrawn, or I always wonder if we can make long-term settlements for aircraft carriers and other things, why can't we do it for housing? So I think somehow long-term settlement is needed. The planning system is an interesting one. At the moment, PRS is not a planning use class. I think there is arguments either way about whether it should be, but I think we need to think about how we do incentivise the rental model in the planning system and in other systems. But to go back to the original questions, I do think that social rent is important. It is part of the mix, but we do need that broader rental offer, and PRS is part of it. And we do need a broader intermediate housing offer, to use that jargon. Very often, the whole discussion is around social housing, which is very important, and meeting the needs of the most disadvantaged. And very often it's the people on 30, 40, 50,000 pounds who are working jolly hard, who aren't the priority focus of housing departments, of councils up and down the land, and they do tend to get forgotten. And so there's a broader remit beyond social housing, which is tremendously important. That's not to underestimate the importance of social housing too. But where's money going to come from? Well, for social housing, a lot of it will have to come from the public sector, I'm afraid, because that's the reality.
But I just want to say massive thank you to Jack, Stephen, Robert and Ed for the contributions here at the panel. And if you could give them thanks as well.